Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Please sit. You do realize that we're beginning a class on the civil rights movement in the USA, and this is going to be a part of the collaborative teaching pedagogy. And so you can see a group of teachers, which may surprise you. But I think it's best if we introduced ourselves. I'm Professor Nishi Pandey from the University of Lucknow, from the Department of English, and I would be looking at the literature component.
I'm Pooja Juyal. I teach political science at Isabella Thoburn College. I'll be taking the first lecture on civil rights and women.
I'm Smita Verma. I'm in the Department of Sociology in the Isabella Thoburn College, and I'll be also touching a portion of the civil rights movement which would be on the African American family.
I'm Dr. Anupma Srivastava, and I am in the Department of Economics at Isabella Thoburn College, Lucknow, and I'll be looking at the economic aspect of the civil rights movement in America.
I think we should sit.
Yeah, okay.
So the way this lecture is structured, I think I need to say a little bit about how we are going to go about this. We will be talking about the civil rights movement, and within that framework, we will be using many kinds of pedagogies. So as we do collaborative teaching, you will see that the PowerPoint presentation would also be given to you. We will be using handouts, we'll be using the chalk and talk method. There's so many other ways, maybe showing you little films and clips. So it's going to be a kind of pedagogy which I hope is going to be interesting, and I hope you're all looking forward to it. We are looking forward to being with you and teaching you this course. So I would now request Dr. Jayal to begin the initial lecture, the framework. Within that framework, we will all be putting in our efforts. And please feel free to ask questions. You will know when you would like. Maybe you can take down your questions, and when a section of it has been taught, then you could ask, right? Feel free. And so the more interactive it is, the better it is for you, the better it is for us. You'll get the best from us if you interact with us. Dr. Jayal.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. I begin with the civil rights movement in the United States of America, and particularly I'd like to share with you that this is really one of the most inspiring moments of American history. And I was reading somewhere that, in the Time magazine to be precise, that it was, an author said that if this hadn't happened, America would not have to have, would not be able to use its legitimacy in human rights leadership, because the civil rights movement was able to eliminate a lot of negative issues within the society of United States, that America today can stand as a leader in many issues, especially the human rights issue. We begin with tracing its growth and evolution, the civil rights movement in the United States. I begin by making some acknowledgement of the sources that I have used. And first, I think I'd like to make a clarification of the terminology that we have used. You know, we use the word black. It requires a little explanation. You know, at one time, it was considered offensive, but later on, in the 1960s, it was adopted as a term which was to show the legitimacy and the militancy and the self-awareness of the people. Because earlier, the term that was used was colored people or Negroes, and then it was realized that, you know, the notion should be that, you know, to be proud and to be black. So it arose from the movement itself. And another term that we use interchangeably is the word Afro-American. Even if we use the word black, I hope you will understand that we use it in a very positive and sense and we will be using it frequently. This was the term used by the African American people, and it was used very strongly after the Second World War. Because having made their contribution in the Second World War, the Afro-Americans felt that they had a full right to demand certain things which were not pleasant to them, things like segregation in society, which they were experiencing at that time. Now, way back in 1945, the effort to desegregate the society had been begun by earlier presidents like Truman. And we must remember that this was not an easy process. It was a process of struggle. And in the struggle, the people were making an effort, making their protests, and they were very strongly supported by the administration at times, and very, very strongly supported by the courts. And the courts gave some very outstanding judgments by which much of the segregation, the discrimination that was practiced in society, that was pushed back. And we will be focusing on some of these judgments as we come across. Now, we must understand that when we're using the word civil rights, it is rooted in the history of the United States, because the Afro-American was actually the result of the slavery that had been practiced in United States very early, and in the 18th century, we discovered that it had become a very important component for the economic strength of the southern states. You know, even within America, there were the northern and the southern states, and the southern states and their agricultural economy was based on cotton, and it was based on tobacco, and they required a good amount of labor, and so they were very reluctant to get rid of slavery, even though gradually people had started realizing that it was not such a good institution. Exactly what happened, let us look at the kind of discrimination that was practiced in America long after slavery, the institution of slavery, had been declared illegal. Public spaces, hotels, motels, schools, colleges, transportation, and accommodation were also segregated by the color of one's skin. And even highly educated blacks were denied the right to vote. They were denied the right to serve on the juries. They could not eat at lunch counters, register in motels, use restrooms, and so on. And so the consequence of all this segregation and discrimination was that the representation of the Afro-American in jobs, in income, in housing, in education, and in accessing health was it was backward. So I will go a little further and show you some of these visuals. They seem traumatic at this time, but these were the truth in the 1950s of United States. We cater to white trade. These were the colored waiting rooms, and it seems rather horrible at this time, colored dining room. And so this was it was an issue which had, the responsible people were unhappy about it. And yet, since, as I've mentioned, it had its root in economics, it was very difficult to completely remove the total vestiges of this institution. And so Kennedy said at one time, and he gives the figures, we'll give you a handout of this later, that a baby born in an Afro-American community has about 1/2 as much a chance of completing high school as a white baby born on the same way. And then he goes on to say, what are his chances compared to the white to complete education or to become a professional. And in all cases, in this very famous speech, he discovers that the Afro-Americans find themselves at a deep disadvantage. But before we start talking about the civil rights movement, perhaps very quickly, a historical dateline, which I will go through very fast, and we can give it to you in a handout.
We do have a handout. We have a handout which we will be giving to you.
So we see the First War of Independence, 1776, the American Declaration of Independence, the Civil War between 61 to 65. Most importantly, the abolition of slavery in certain areas, and 1963, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declaring free all slaves in Confederate States. Article 14 and Amendment 14 and 15 gave the right to suffrage to the black person, incidentally only to the men. And this is where we can connect later to another discussion when we are talking about women's suffrage, because the women didn't get the right. And so there was a lot of animosity in the hearts of women that the African American male had got suffrage, but the women had been denied this right, and they were denied this right till 1920, which was a long period. Then we go very quickly to see that the leadership of the civil rights movement had been taken up by a group which was called the Association for Advancement of Colored People. And there was another group in which Martin Luther King was very active, and that was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I'm sure all of us have heard about Dr. Martin Luther King, one of the titans, one of the leaders, the great leaders really of the last century. The impact of him, of his efforts, they touch the American society very deeply. His inspirational leadership, even today, if you read about him, touches the heart of any right-thinking person. Any person who's even thinking about justice will find that that Martin Luther King was one of the greats of this century, or let's say the 20th century. And now let us come to some very interesting, an interesting discussion. I'm holding this, the slide. 1954, there was a ruling in the Supreme Court which reversed an older judgment. There was an older judgment which was of 1896, which was Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that it was okay to have separate but equal facilities. Was okay. But then we discovered that it was in 1954 that the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas said that it was not okay to have separate but equal. They said even anything which was separate, even if it was equal, was actually not a good arrangement to have. And they said separate but nominally equal needs to go. And that, my friends, just opened up the gates to the lot of simmering discontent among the Afro-Americans and also among so many white people. And here was this movement which was very, very strongly supported by the liberal group, by the clergy. And then we discover, look at this, when the first, look at this is it's a very poignant photograph of a woman and her child. It's a woman, black women were denied education just as men were, and the whole promise that you can read in this picture about, how desegregation impacts lives and how removal of it would impact life positively even more. And then I also want to talk to you about this individual called Rosa Parks. And she was this feisty woman. And in 1953, here, there were separate trains, there were separate transports, and they had to use a separate door, sit in separate seats. And here was Rosa Parks, middle-aged woman, seamstress, or tailor, who was asked in Alabama to get up because a white man wanted a seat. And she just refused. And once she refused, this led to a change of events. And here is Rosa Parks when she refused to get up. And here is Rosa Parks at a much later time when she was honored by the president as well. And then, there was a series of boycotts in buses, in public accommodation, in voting, in housing. Just imagine being told, you can't live in these houses, they will not take you. So these kind of changes which took place, this is another very fascinating thing which happened. there used to be freedom rides. Men and women, Afro-American and even whites who believed in the cause, they decided to travel from Washington to down south in buses, and they would, in a mixed way, and then they would stop, and the whites would use the facilities for the blacks, and the Afro-American would use the facility which were reserved for the whites. And you know, this kind of a change which they were showing in practice, it was not very well accepted. It was a struggle. It was done, and it made one major change. And so President Eisenhower made his changes. Now, this is a very interesting case where when in a place called Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957, when a student wanted to enter the school, the head of the institution refused to let him enter, and so there had to be federal troops from Washington, troops from the center, sent in to ensure that the student should be allowed to enter. And then there is President Kennedy making an important statement, talking about how it was important for America to remove that. And similarly, it was in 1962 when President Kennedy had to send troops so that a student could enter the university. Look at the troops. Does it look like a university? So much troops for, and so you discover, so we see that the movement caught the imagination of many right-thinking people, and this is one of the watersheds of the 20th century history. It was Washington, and it was August 1963, when Martin Luther King collected a group of people, and about 25,000 people marched in Washington in a very famous march. And that march, it absolutely shook the people. And the speech that he made is one of the finest pieces of literature, I would imagine. And he says, we've come here with a check, like a check, a bank check. And we discover that the blank check is not valid. Our country promised us equality, freedom, liberty, and this check is not being honored. Of course, he didn't say it in the rough, rude way I'm saying it. He said it in a very emotional way, with 25,000 people clapping, agreeing, singing. It was fabulous, when you read about it and see clips about it. And those magnificent words were, instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. And so he goes on to say, and this is Martin Luther King. He was a minister, trained for the church, was assassinated eventually. And this phrase, I'm sure you've heard, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they are not going to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So well spoken. And these are pictures of the march. Look at that awesome picture. And so the consequence was that some changes were made, 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, 1965, but 1968, King paid the price for all the protest. He was assassinated. And the consequence of this was also really, no one expected the kind of rioting and unhappiness. Going back again, because when you're talking about movements, there are things which overlap. And here we discover that he also started what was known as a Project C, Project Confrontation. We will confront, address the issues and oppose it. And the result was, of course, there was an individual called Medgar Evers who was killed. And look at the kind of brutal opposition to his protests. To the protests in Alabama, there was this, we know about these. This photograph speaks for itself. Look at this, the brutality of the police. Dogs were set upon the protesters. And then we discover that though changes were taking place in law, but in society, things were changing a little more slowly because access to jobs was still not so quick. And so we see that the economic gaps between most blacks and most whites did not lessen.